I'm Dave Dinkle, and this is our video series of actual recent deals. The following is a real estate deal that was recently completed by a student. The deal exemplifies some of the various aspects of how to do these transactions. When we say no money in the transaction, in some cases a student may have had to put up a $100 deposit, or if the deposit was larger, he could have even borrowed that deposit. But essentially we're looking at no money deals unless otherwise specified. As I've always done so as not to embarrass anyone involved in this transaction, all parties have been kept anonymous. I'm not a CPA, an attorney, or a realtor, and any information derived or found in this presentation is not to be construed as legal or accounting advice. Now, this is an example of a double closing, except the first leg, the A to B, was done directly with a deed with the property owner. So seller A, the property owner, sold to the buyer B, which is a student, who then sold to buyer C, in this case happened to be a hedge fund. No closing agent was used on the A to B transaction. There was no requirement for a closing agent to be used. There is never a requirement. What has to happen to make it a safe transaction is simply to do a lien search, and that's what the student did himself. So to recap as we go forward, no money in the deal, no credit required to buy it, no risk on the investor's part, but he did have to put in some sweat equity to clean up the property, as you'll see. Now as a general overview, the student put out bandit signs and got one call from a frustrated seller who owned a duplex. The seller's issue was the listing agent wasn't getting him a buyer, and he disliked her very much because she wasn't doing anything to sell his duplex. Now this is a inexpensive listing and probably didn't matter very much to her, and she figured or assumed that because it was on the MLS it would sell quickly, especially at the price it was at, because the offering price was less than $25,000. Now remember, this is a duplex and it's a livable duplex. The student met with the seller the next day, and he found that the property was due for a tax deed sale coming up in a few weeks, but it also had city liens and personal judgments attached to it. I would assume, and I hate to assume anything, but if other investors had looked at the property, they would have done a lien search and found these tax deed sale coming up, city liens, personal judgments, and decided it's too much of a hassle. They would go to the tax deed sale and possibly bid on it there. It doesn't matter. The reality is this is a motivated seller, and he needs to get rid of the property. Continuing the general background or overview, the property owner had not had any offers since listing with the agent over 3 months ago, and the student did a great job in carefully checking out each issue with the property: the amount of the property taxes that were due, the amount of the personal judgments attached to the property, and the city liens. The biggest problem may have been that the seller originally was thinking that he wanted $25,000 to walk away, but the key was the seller would only have netted a few $1,000s at most on this purchase price. Great hindsight and being able to see what the actual expenses are, including and with the listing agent's commission, the seller would have had to bring money to closing, which would not have worked. Now, interestingly enough, the seller was difficult to contact despite the fact that he was living in one side of the duplex. The other side of the duplex was so full of trash that he had to move out and moved into the one side. So when the student actually got around to seeing the property before he saw the actual seller, this is the sort of picture that he got. That's the backyard filled with debris, I'm going to say, but it was obviously something that the seller collected and wanted. And inside, this is the area where he was actually living. Now, when the student saw the property, besides the place being filled with junk and debris, the most memorable part, as he related to me, was the really foul odor that was going on. Remember, that's the smell of money. You get into these properties that really stink, usually cat or urine or dog feces, and those are the ones that most people walk away from, but they can all be cleaned up. It took an extra 2 weeks to finally meet with the seller, so the deadline for the tax deed sale was closing in rather rapidly. Remember, at the tax deed sale, the owner would get nothing. In fact, the owner would be evicted shortly thereafter. So he was facing the reality of he was going to be homeless with no money. Student offered to pay for all outstanding problems and net the seller $4,000 to walk away. Now, the way he did that is he showed the seller, here's what has to be paid off if you sell the property. So the reality of trying to get $25,000 isn't going to work. I'll give you $4,000. Originally, the seller countered at $5,000, but the student held steady at $4,000. Now remember, this is a duplex that's livable. Is this $4,000 seller crazy or what? No, he's a motivated seller. He's realistic enough to understand that if he doesn't finally take action after hesitating for months or years, he's going to walk away with nothing. So $4,000 looks pretty good. So the seller went to the listing agent with a contract from the student. And of course the listing agent absolutely went ballistic. The listing agent wanted the sales price to be over $23,000. So she could get a commission on this amount, not the $4,000. I'm going to show you in a minute the payoff from the closing. If it had been at $23,000 or higher, the seller would have had to bring money to closing, the realtor's commission, as well as pay off the taxes, judgments, and city liens. So that wasn't going to work. The student called me and said, what can I do now? And from the beginning I had said to him, one of the options here was literally to simply go ahead and have the seller sign a warranty deed to the student and then go ahead and record it. So the student would then become the official owner of the property. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, you have to go through a closing, you have to have an attorney, you have to have a closing agent to do that. Not at all true. Most often you see these direct seller deeds as quitclaim deeds, and they're usually from elderly parents to their children who then record the quitclaim deed. And quitclaim means that the seller quits all responsibility for whatever's going on in the property. A warranty deed stipulates that the seller has liability for what's occurred during his ownership of the property. That's great for the title policy. The quitclaim deed literally clouds the title policy under that period where the quitclaim deed took place. Oftentimes the quitclaim deed isn't filed by the children of the elderly parent until after their death, which really then clouds the title because it has to go through probate anyway. So if you're going to do that, if you're going to have a quitclaim deed from your parents, file it right away. And the reason I hear, well, I don't want to file it right away because my parents will feel that they no longer own the home. Don't worry about their feelings. It's better to do it right than to wait. And frankly, it doesn't matter if they own their own home anymore. They can always put it in trust for you if they wanted to do that. And then when something happened to them, it would bypass probate. Now, the listing agent, I'm going to say, was not happy. That's kind of an understatement. And sent the student all kinds of threats by email, telephone messages, said that it was legally impossible for the seller to sell that property because she had a contract. The listing agent had a listing agreement on the property. That's true. She did have a listing agreement. She was entitled to be paid a commission on the sale, but on the sale price, and the sale price was $4,000. Just because the agent says that she knows more than you do or he knows more than you do doesn't necessarily mean it's absolutely true. In many cases, they don't know more than you do as an investor. Now, the seller had the contract with the listing agent. Again, the seller had the contract with the listing agent, not the student. So the seller would have had to pay the listing commission on the sale. Again, not the student. It's not the student's responsibility. And if we're talking about commissions, let's assume she had a 6% commission coming to her on $4,000. Be about $240. That's slightly different than $1,300 on the $23,000, whatever that number is exactly. The student did not pay the seller the $4,000 up front. This is very, very important. If he had paid the $4,000 up front, got the warranty deed from the seller, recorded it, he'd be the owner, but you still had a squatter in the property now. You didn't have a tenant. You had somebody that you'd have to evict. So he did it correctly, exactly as I told him. He paid the seller $2,000 upon signing the deed, and $2,000 a week later when the previous owner and soon-to-be squatter, so to speak, actually moved out. As soon as the seller had vacated the premises, the student started a cleanup instead of simply wholesaling the property. The typical reaction on most people's parts as new investors is sell that puppy. I got it. Put a sign in the yard. Let's sell it. Typically the way it's done. However, that's not where the big money is. Remember, this property was listed for a little over about $23,000, and it wasn't selling. And the reason is, if you remember the pictures I showed you of all the trash, not treasures, just trash. So the cleanup significantly increased the value of the property, as you're going to see in a minute or so. And this is what the junk looked like. That's one dumpster. That's a second dumpster. You can tell they're different dumpsters by the serial numbers and where they're located. They put them in different spots in the yard. This is the sweat equity. The student had to physically go in, clean out all that junk. Let's get down to the bottom line here. The total cost to pay off the seller's stuff, which were liens, judgments, and the tax certificates which were coming up, amounted to $2,000 for the seller to sign the warranty deed, $2,000 paid when the seller vacated, $100 for the pre-lien search. Before they had the seller sign the warranty deed, they did a lien search. Now right here I want to tell you an idea that I said to the student if they wanted to do it. Now that they're on title, they have an option. They could pay the tax certificates that were coming up for the tax deed sale, and then the only thing that would be attached would be the liens from the city, which they could take care of, and the judgments, the personal judgments against the previous seller. Now they could go ahead and never pay the personal judgments against the seller, rehab the property enough to have tenants in it, and rent it ad infinitum. Ultimately what would happen is the seller's liens against the property would disappear after a certain number of years. In our state it happens to be 7 years, unless they were re-recorded, which was unlikely, and they would have a property that was free and clear. They didn't want to hold it for income. They wanted to sell it and take a profit in it. There's a $6,000 first credit card that was owed by the seller. The student negotiated that down from $16,500. There was a second credit card in place that was negotiated down from $6,600 to $5,163. Now that's not a big reduction. And the matter of fact is the previous realtor's closing agent tried to negotiate this card, and this credit card company then knew that the property was going to be sold. So it would have been better if they had approached them sooner, but it was not in the student's control to do that. $1,094 for 2012 taxes that were not paid. Those are non-negotiable. $6,272 for 3 years of unpaid taxes, which brought the property to schedule the tax deed sale. In other words, the person that bought the third certificate in our state has the ability to go for a tax deed sale. So these tax certificates were then paid off by the student, as well as accrued taxes for 2012. $800 in fees for the two 30-yard dumpsters that you saw. Typically with dumpsters, so you understand, there's two important things. They drive up, they drop the dumpster, and if they're going to drop it on a driveway or something where it can be cracked, some kind of cement, it probably will be. What you need to do is get a piece of plywood, preferably 3/8 inch or 1/4 inch as a minimum, and put it under the wheels of the dumpster in the back. That will keep it from crushing the sidewalk when it's first dropped. You can be there when the dumpster comes. The other thing is, although you're supposed to fill the dumpsters only to the top, you can pretty much get away with a little over. But try and put the stuff in the dumpster orderly so you don't have to have 2 or 3 dumpsters when you only need 1 or 2. And finally, if you're going to do dumpsters and construction at the same time, have all your construction debris saved somewhere so that when the dumpster guy comes up, you can literally load it and have him take it off pretty much right away. Otherwise, you're signaling a big red flag to code enforcement in the neighborhood. I'm doing a rehab. And when they drive by and see that it has bathroom vanities and toilets and kitchen cabinets and stuff like that, you're going to set yourself up for a code violation immediately. Typically, they tag the property. It says, stop all work on the property, and they mean it. There was $150 that they hired somebody to help them for the cleanup. So the total of all that was $23,579 cost basis after everything had been paid off. So now the student owns the property, and he has to think about, gee whiz, what am I going to do to sell it? Now remember, he's already paid the seller $4,000, and he's looking at paying off that $23,000 and change. How did he do that? Well, he literally called up a private money lender, and he said, I need to borrow $25,000 in this case, or he borrowed that money that he needed out of an equity line, as a matter of fact, and I remember. and he said, I need $25,000 for this transaction. He laid out what the costs were going to be because he'd called the city and he'd done what he needed to do. And he started to negotiate and pay off those liens. But now he has it under his name on the public record. He's on title and he's ready to go. So what he does, first of all, is puts a for sale by owner sign in the front yard, but only after he finished the entire cleanup. He also posted the property on Craigslist, and another wholesaler called him with a property that he had for sale. So he got a lead, but more importantly, he got a call from a hedge fund who purchased the property for $56,000. Now, previously to paying his seller his $4,000, the student borrowed $25,000 from a private money lender and repaid him with 1 year's interest at 10%, even though it was sold and closed in 1 month. Is that a lot to pay? It's not really a question, because if you don't have the money to do it, it's pretty cheap. And most oftentimes, if you go to a private lender, he's going to say to you, here's the deal. I see you're going to make some money on this. Let's split the profit. Now, if you're really desperate, then you can split the profit because you have no money in the deal. It's better to make $10,000 than it is to make nothing because you couldn't complete the deal. But you can find private money lenders who, in fact, will loan at 6, 8, or 10%. In this case, the student was very generous in paying the private money lender 10% at one time because it closed very, very quickly. Again, the student had no money, no credit, and no risk in the deal. The private money lender sent the money first, and he used that money to pay both the seller and pay off the other expenses. And now, I mentioned to you before that he had some of his own money. Actually, he didn't need very much at all because the city, you'll find out in a moment, once he cleaned up the property, reduced the liens to zero. So that expense that we had in there did not come true. So here's the closing sequence. First of all, the A to B transaction, which is between the original seller, the property owner of the duplex, looked like a warranty deed signed directly to the student and recorded in the public record. Now, the B to C transaction was between the student and, I mentioned to you, a hedge fund buyer. Before I actually show you the HUD statement in a moment or so, I have this little quip here. When I looked at the pictures that the student sent me, I have to say this. You ever complain to your partner that the kitchen needs cleaning? Here's how this individual is living, if you can see that. Was there anything wrong with him? No. Emotionally? No. The guy just wasn't very good at keeping house, and that's the way it was. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to go on and look at the HUD statement, and we're not covering the other documents needed for the closing. Now, there's no other documents needed on the A to B other than the warranty deed. However, on the B to C, it's a normal closing package, and I'm not going to go through those. There's plenty of other times where I talk about what your closing agent may want, and it varies only slightly. You're going to have to sign a deed. You're going to have to sign possibly a bill of sale and some other disclosures to cover the attorney more than anything else. So this is the B to C HUD statement. Here's the A to B to begin with. That's the warranty deed. But then we go into the student selling to the hedge fund. Now, before I bring it up, remember on the left side of the HUD is the buyer. On the right side is the seller. Okay, here's the buyer. You'll see they paid $56,000. Here's the seller side, which is the student. Now, don't worry if you can't see these numbers. I'm going to break it down for you as I always do. This is the top half of the HUD, and I've very carefully removed the names of all the parties involved so I don't embarrass anyone or get anyone in any sort of predicament. So here's the bottom half of the HUD 1 statement, page 1, and we're going to look at the numbers. There's the purchase price, $56,000. It's going to be the same on the student side because that's how much he's going to be receiving. The settlement charges from the second page are $103.50, it looks like, for the end buyer, which is very, very inexpensive. Why? Because our student paid most of the closing costs. His were $1,004. Now here's taxes, and that becomes a credit to the buyer and a debit to our student on the other side. So the bottom line is, here's what the end buyer hedge fund had to bring to closing, and here's what the student received. And this is the only number that's important, $54,577.23. That's the cash out price from the sale of the property. Now what does all this mean? All right, the student had $23,579 hard costs, meaning the dumpsters and all those various things, plus $2,500 interest expense for a total of $29,079 in out-of-pocket expenses. His proceeds from the sale, as I showed you above, were $54,577.23. So his net profit was $25,498. Now the key here is no money, no credit, and no risk in the transaction. So he purchased the property with a private money loan and no money in the deal from himself virtually. It was sold after he cleaned it out. No rehabbing. He didn't put in new kitchens and baths and things like that. No floor coverings. We call this a light wholesale. Wholesale means a wholesale to retail price. That's above wholesale but below retail. So typically this sort of duplex in this area might bring $75,000 to $80,000, maybe even more. And the end buyer, the hedge fund, is going to go in there, clean it up, and then reappraise it for their portfolio substantially higher than what they paid for it. And they'll collect rent on it until they take it public. The student got a warranty deed directly from the seller, as I mentioned, as the listing agent's title company had been working for 3 months, supposedly, to clear the title with no success, and no one had come by to actually make an offer to the agent or the seller in that 3 months. Why? Well, if they drove by to see the property, the place looked like bad. Now, because the student took immediate action to clean up the property, the city actually waived all outstanding liens and fines against the property, which were about $3,000. So the investor student netted $25,498.23 with no money, no credit, and no risk in the deal. Thanks for joining us today for another one of our recent deals.